All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our session today on bias in STEM and engineering and improving inclusion. My name is Shelby. I'm a career education counselor, and we have Professor Herworth with us as well. Professor Herworth, did you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. I'm engineering instructor at Glendale Community College. My background's mechanical engineering.
All right, fantastic. And to start us off, we wanted to cover the topics we're going to be talking about so you know what's covered in this workshop, because we could talk about bias in STEM for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, these slides are very content heavy. So don't feel the need to take notes. Again, it's going to be on our YouTube. You can take screen grabs. We can give you a PDF, but we'll really be kind of doing an overview and giving you some basic information on the current state of bias in STEM and engineering. Some concepts that we're going to talk about today are stereotype threat and imposter phenomenon, addressing bias within ourselves, then speaking up when bias occurs amongst a group or amongst others, programs and strategies overall for improving inclusion, and then next steps. What do we do now? Where do we go from here to better make a more inclusive STEM environment? So again, you can see the text heaviness starts with this slide. But just to do a quick introduction of what brings Professor Herworth and I to lead this workshop is because it's a passion of both of ours. So for me, I did graduate research on bystander intervention and combating hate speech on college campuses. Of course, when we talk about bias in STEM, it's rarely to the degree of hate speech, but I am just passionate about social justice and combating bias. Constantly learning new things, learning about updates in language, better ways to communicate. And I just want to make sure you all know mistakes are expected from all of us, and we have to be able to move forward, learn new things, adapt to the changes in our culture, and that these are nuanced and layered issues. There's multiple intersecting pieces of our identity that will play a role. And I'm really glad to see that we've got different people with different identities already here in terms of a lot of people think of gender bias in STEM, but we are going to talk about all different kinds of biases, not just gender bias, but of course that one as well. And then we actually pulled this from Professor Herworth's bio on the GCC website. But as you can see, it's been a focus of Professor Herworth's work as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Professor Herworth?
No, that's okay. I mean, that's really, well, just that it's really the motivation to teach is to help people. And where there's a problem like this, where there's a lower participation by people, that you have to go after that and try to improve that. So that's kind of my orientation in terms of my career, right? So yeah, thanks.
Exactly. No, that's great. And so I did want to emphasize a couple of things as well. We are leading and facilitating this workshop, but we don't see ourselves as like an authority on this subject. Everyone is the authority of their own experience, right? We've experienced different biases, but not every single one. And so it's important to share resources. That's what we're here to do our part to self-educate ourselves and to help y'all learn more about this. And these conversations with bias and inequality and disproportionate impacts of systemic racism and systemic patriarchy and gender issues, that can cause discomfort. I just want to normalize that, make sure we know that's okay. Feel free to ask any questions. And we are coming in with multiple privileged identities as well, right? I am a woman, so women are biased against in general in STEM, but also I'm a white woman. That means I bring a lot of privilege with me as well. And so it's important to hear directly from people with various backgrounds and perspectives. And so we're going to share links throughout to other people talking about these issues as well. Starting off with, we actually had a presentation last semester in spring from the ASGCC that was recorded. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you. It was from a GCC alumni who works in computer engineering. And she talked about the biases that she had encountered and what she's been doing to overcome those. So if you want to save that link for later, put that in the chat right now. There's also a great video from our GCC lecture series, which was a year ago now, like during the, I think, fall 2020 semester. We had a series of lectures on anti-racism and specifically on unconscious bias. So I'm putting those links in the chat. We had some professors from our sociology department lead those. So feel free to bookmark those for later. But for now, let's actually start with a visualization activity. So what do I mean by visualization? I mean, if you're watching this video later, or if you're here right now, you're gonna, if you're comfortable and safely can do so, close your eyes and start to focus in on your breath. And we're gonna pretend we're not just sitting in a chair or laying in our bed or wherever you are right now. We are going to visualize something that I'm gonna guide us through. So I'm telling you to just take a few deep breaths so you can get relaxed, so you can really use your imagination here. And so we are finally to the point in your mind where the COVID-19 pandemic has been reduced and we can travel again. So you have the opportunity through a student organization at Glendale to travel to a local STEM conference. So this is the world we live in now. You're getting really excited to go to this conference, but because we still have some precautions, you're going to have to check in with a nurse on campus to get the okay first. So visualize yourself on the GCC campus, right? You're making your way over to the health center, to the nurse's office, and you make your way past a student giving a passionate speech about a social justice issue that they care about. You want to listen, but you're on a deadline, so you go ahead and continue to the health center. The nurse checks you in, approves you, you're good to go on the trip. You walk back across campus and are loading onto a bus that's going to drive you to this conference. As you're waiting, you're a little bit early. You chill in the bus, looking out the window, taking in the campus. You see outside on the lawn, there's a couple enjoying a romantic picnic. You're like, oh, that's interesting. So you kind of people watch a little bit. And then the bus takes off. You travel, you're finally at the conference. And the keynote speech is presented by a local CEO of a big tech company. Okay, I walked you pretty quickly through a day. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about what you visualize. So, when you walked past a student giving a speech, what was their gender, ethnicity, and age? Were they vocally speaking or were they using an interpreter? Did they have a North American accent or another dialect? Were they standing or in a wheelchair? And when you went and saw the nurse, what did that nurse look like? What was their gender, ethnicity, and age? And then when you saw the couple outside the window having a picnic, was it a cisgender heterosexual couple? And last but not least, the CEO tech company giving a big speech at the conference. What was the gender, ethnicity, age of that individual? So I ask you those questions because usually we visualize something that we'd see most commonly. For example, when we see a big tech CEO, we assume it's going to be a man. But was it in your imagination, right? I do this activity to really show you what's called implicit bias, which is our unconscious bias, which means when we picture something in our head, when we picture a doctor or a nurse, we usually have some mental picture, and it's usually based on stereotypical societal ideas. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but it does show us that we have an internalized worldview and way that we expect something to be, right? How many times in terms of bias in STEM have you heard a woman say that she was in a lab and people assumed that she was a secretary rather than someone working in the lab or something like that, right? That's because of that internalized worldview that we have, that we bring into the way that we picture the world and the assumptions that we make without even realizing we're making assumptions. So just to clarify a little bit more about bias before we move on from this activity, we just live in a society where through media and our everyday interactions with people, we are kind of swimming in the sea of racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, transphobia, homophobia. I could list a lot more, but just we have groups that are privileged and that are oppressed within our society, and that's represented in ways that we unconsciously pick up, even if we don't want to. And so a lot of the bias that impacts people in STEM is unconscious. It's not people being overtly or out loud biased. It's really these unconscious assumptions that end up really building up over time, including what's called microaggressions. And for these topics, if you're interested, you can definitely take a sociology class for your general education as a way to learn a little bit more. But just as a brief introduction, microaggressions seem like subtle slights. Like, again, assuming a woman in a lab doesn't work there or that she's not a scientist. that might seem like, oh, it was just a small mistake. But if that happens to that woman every single time she's in a lab, it's not small to her, right? And so microaggressions are things that might be perceived as small, but that build up over time and that people with more marginalized identities experience more often. So if you want to read more about those, Dr. Chester Pierce coined the term in the 1970s, and Dr. Daryl Wing Su did a lot of research into this and the negative impacts of these microaggressions. But for the purposes of today, since we do cover a lot of information, we're going to just go into the basic biases that exist in STEM. And we can't cover everything, but we're going to cover a few examples. So again, there's a lot of data here that we're not going to go into, but I'm going to provide you with these slides if you want to look into this anymore after. But first of all, a gender bias in STEM is not just in the United States an issue, but a global issue. So less than 30% of the world's researchers are women. And then if you even track that back to education, we have under enrollment of women in STEM programs. So only 3% of students joining information and communication technology are women, 5% mathematics and statistics, and 8% engineering, manufacturing, and construction. So just to read a few more of these statistics about men versus women, and again, I'm using a very binary version of gender, so my apologies for that. But once women get into the field, they tend to be more sexually harassed during their fieldwork process. And just 12% in the media, characters with identifiable STEM careers are women. In terms of recommendation letters, this is from people who are trying to combat their bias. This is people who work in geoscience. They actually showed subtle gender biases favoring male students in their letters of recommendation. And also in terms of speaking opportunities at conferences, there's more often men speakers than women speakers, and that has been proven, for example, in this geophysical union meeting. But it exists, this is just one example. It exists in more than this example. And then another factor is, say you make it through education and into the field, a lot of women end up leaving full-time science after their first child, right? So are we creating an inclusive space where they feel like they can continue to be a full-time scientist even after taking care of a child or during that parenting process? Let's also jump ahead to ethnicity, right? So this is a really awful one, the first one. In over 40 years, they did a quantitative study over that time and saw that there's really been no meaningful progress on racial and ethnic diversity in the geosciences. In terms of students who start as a STEM major and then leave that STEM major, Black and Latinx students leave at a higher rate. Black students in STEM majors are more likely to experience those racial microaggressions, and Black women, because they're being impacted both as a minoritized race and a minoritized gender, they have the highest rates of that microaggression discrimination. Here's a quote from a woman who changed from STEM to non-STEM. She said, "Sadly, I encountered that others like myself within the humanities who had to change their major because of their race." So she feels like that was the primary factor of changing from STEM to non-STEM, was what she experienced based on ethnicity and race. This person says, "Every time I walk into a lab, I always get looks. I don't know if it's not because I look like a STEM major or if it's because I'm Black, but I get those looks," right? So these are just a couple more examples. When we looked at resumes that were completely identical and then used names with kind of cultural associations with those names, Black and Latinx candidates were rated as less competent than Asian and white candidates. So employers and people looking at these resumes rated people lower just based on their name. It was the same resume, and also rated as less hireable. So we know that this is unconscious bias. It has nothing to do with their competence in anything because it's the same resume, but it's the biases that exist in the field. All right, let's also talk about disability. So first of all, this one starts early in high school, where students with disabilities complete fewer credits in math and science that are, of course, those foundational building blocks for STEM careers. And usually they start to think they're less qualified because they're discouraged from taking those classes. There's also a lack of research on people with disabilities in the STEM field. And also disabilities is a huge group, right? There's learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health challenges, and all of these things impact people in different ways. So when they're all grouped together, it's really hard to create meaningful data from that. And so in general, teachers, instructors, professors felt underprepared or ill-equipped to recognize and address the needs of students with disabilities. and 1 out of every 10 students in higher education identify as having a disability. So it is a big group that we are not serving as well as we could, or that we are causing to leave STEM fields. And then in terms of once people graduate and enter the field, stereotypes, lack of mentors, and ignorance about the ADA are among the challenges that people in STEM fields with disabilities face in the field. All right, I know I'm going over this very quickly, but again, it's just to cover some of the basics. Last but not least, that we're going to cover specifically today in terms of the state of bias in STEM is LGBTQ plus identities, which is also a large category. But first of all, they've done studies that showed LGBTQ scientists leave STEM fields at higher rates. They found that this one's almost funny, but it's not, where someone who is transgender changed their gender and was basically told they were more competent than their sister, which was actually their name when they were a woman, right? So it was the same research, same person, but once they transitioned, they basically inherited this gender bias, right? They experienced it on a deeper level because they were living as a woman. LGBTQ STEM professionals were more likely to experience career limitations, harassment, and professional devaluation, more frequent health difficulties, and more likely to just intend to leave STEM anyway after facing those discriminations. So that was about the broader category. If we're going to go into same-sex couples specifically and men, they did a quantitative data to show that they're 12 percentage points less likely to have a STEM bachelor's degree. And one thing that came up within the classroom is that it felt like being queer, gay, or lesbian was a topic under discussion in other coursework like English, but in other classes it rarely came up. And that in some ways can make sense, right? When we're talking about a specific software like AutoCAD, right? We're not going to necessarily bring up gender or sexuality, but because it never came up, it wasn't clear whether or not it was okay. That leads to a kind of silence that it's discouraging for people who are queer, right? So bringing that topic into the classroom when we have the chance does help us recognize that it's okay to have these varying identities and be a STEM major. Okay, so I know that was a lot. We're gonna stop listening to me. We're gonna watch a couple of quick videos or video excerpts. So this first one is called Stereotype Threat. This is a phenomenon that this professional will explain, but basically it's something you can encounter as a student if you have a minoritized or marginalized identity.
The idea of stereotype threat is the very simple idea that if you're trying to perform
hear the audio? I just
in
want
an
to
area.
test that. Did you hear that, Chris? Oh, it's good.
Yes,
Okay.
good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Where your group is negatively stereotyped, you're going to feel an extra pressure, a distracting kind of pressure. And that pressure can affect how well you perform. If you don't know about it and you don't know how to deal with it, it can have this kind of effect, and that is a source of this underperformance. It started with an attempt to understand a phenomenon called underperformance, which is that groups whose intellectual abilities, are negatively stereotyped tend to perform worse in subsequent schooling, like high school kids going to college, tend to perform worse than their test scores predict, or than other kids with the same test scores. So you've got sort of roughly the same preparation, but you've got this group whose abilities are negatively stereotyped in the larger society: women in math, minority students, African American students. That's the group we looked at first. We found we could very quickly, easily produce underperformance in the laboratory. For example, if you bring women into the laboratory, women and men who are really good at math and equally good, and you give them a really difficult math test at the frontier of their skills, the women, even though they're just as prepared, don't do as well as the men. So that's underperformance. That's exactly what it is. Two groups equally prepared, but one group, because of this stereotype issue, not performing as well. So eventually, thinking back, probably a year and a half, 2 years, we came up with the idea, well, maybe the stereotype is pressuring this underperformance. And if we could take the stereotype out of that situation, if that's what's causing it, if we could do something that would take the stereotype out of there, then women's performance should go up to match that of equally skilled men. And so eventually we came up with a very simple way of getting the stereotype out of there, which was just before they sat down to take the test, the men and the women, alone in a room, just before they took the test, we told them, look, you know, you may have heard that women don't do as well on standardized math tests as men. You may have heard that, but that's not true for this particular test. On this particular test, women always do as well as men. So with that little instruction, we changed the whole meaning of the situation for women. Now, as they experience frustration on that test, and they would normally worry, are they confirming the stereotype? Are they going to be seen to confirm the stereotype? They don't have that worry because this particular test is a test for which women always do as well as men. There's no pressure. They could worry that they're not going to perform as well. They don't have as much math ability as they thought they did, but they can't worry that that's true because of something about their being a woman. That little anxiety is removed, and when you do that, women perform as well as men. And that was a huge relief and discovery at the same time. I mean, that the stereotypes in society could have that kind of effect on something that we think of as very difficult to modify, performance on a serious standardized test. We did this research with the graduate record exam. These were very talented participants in this research, really strong math students. And to find that the stereotype was depressing women's performance that much, a full standard deviation, something like 15 points on a test of 100 points. That was really a dramatic sort of in the face. This is something big. It wasn't something small, it was something big.
All right, so just to recap, the point to take away from this is not if there's some sort of stereotype against a group identity that you hold that you're automatically going to do worse on tests. But it is to say, if you've noticed that ever happening, it's because part of your mental energy is focused on that self-awareness of, oh, am I confirming a stereotype? Am I confirming that women aren't good at math if I'm doing poorly on this math test? And when they take that pressure away, women were able to perform better. So what is the antidote to this, since we can't just automatically say every time, oh, there's just no difference on this test, right? Like they did in this experiment. We can't always do that in the real world. So what they really talked about as a solution is creating a safe, welcoming environment where people feel like they can fully express their identity and have a sense of belonging and authenticity. So if we can continue to bring that into our classrooms, which is of course something we're always striving for, that is the antidote to this stereotype threat. So if this is the first you've heard of it and you're interested in it, I encourage you to read more. But since we're just doing an overview today, we are going to move on to our next topic. If you have questions, though, always ask. But our next topic is something kind of similar, kind of different. It also impacts academic performance and career performance, but it's called Imposter Phenomenon. So we're just going to watch this quick TED Ed video about that.
Even after writing 11 books and winning several prestigious awards, Maya Angelou couldn't escape the nagging doubt that she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received.
Sorry, that was my fault. Let's go back to where we were.
Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. Accomplishments at the level of Angelou's or Einstein's are rare, but their feeling of fraudulence is extremely common. Why can't so many of us shake feelings that we haven't earned our accomplishments, or that our ideas and skills aren't worthy of others' attention? Psychologist Pauline Rose Clance was the first to study this unwarranted sense of insecurity. In her work as a therapist, she noticed many of her undergraduate patients shared a concern. Though they had high grades, they didn't believe they deserved their spots at the university. Some even believed their acceptance had been an admissions error. While Clance knew these fears were unfounded, she could also remember feeling the exact same way in graduate school. She and her patients experienced something that goes by a number of names: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. Together with colleague Suzanne Imes, Clance first studied imposterism in female college students and faculty. Their work established pervasive feelings of fraudulence in this group. Since that first study, the same thing has been established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations, though it may be prevalent and disproportionately affect the experiences of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. To call it a syndrome is to downplay how universal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem. Where do these feelings of fraudulence come from? People who are highly skilled or accomplished tend to think others are just as skilled. This can spiral into feelings that they don't deserve accolades and opportunities over other people. And as Angelou and Einstein experienced, there's often no threshold of accomplishment that puts these feelings to rest. Feelings of imposterism aren't restricted to highly skilled individuals either. Everyone is susceptible to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where we each doubt ourselves privately, but believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else voices their doubts. Since it's tough to really know how hard our peers work, how difficult they find certain tasks, or how much they doubt themselves, there's no easy way to dismiss feelings that we're less capable than the people around us. Intense feelings of imposterism can prevent people from sharing their great ideas or applying for jobs and programs where they'd excel. At least so far, the most surefire way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Many people suffering from imposter syndrome are afraid that if they ask about their performance, their fears will be confirmed. And even when they receive positive feedback, it often fails to ease feelings of fraudulence. But on the other hand, hearing that an advisor or mentor has experienced feelings of imposterism can help relieve those feelings. The same goes for peers. Even simply finding out there's a term for these feelings can be an incredible relief. Once you're aware of the phenomenon, you can combat your own imposter syndrome by collecting and revisiting positive feedback. One scientist who kept blaming herself for problems in her lab started to document the causes every time something went wrong. Eventually, she realized most of the problems came from equipment failure and came to recognize her own competence. We may never be able to banish these feelings entirely, but we can have open conversations about academic or professional challenges. With increasing awareness of how common these experiences are, perhaps we can feel freer to be frank about our feelings and build confidence in some simple truths. You have talent, you are capable, and you belong.
All right.
Everyone can
so
use
with
a
that
little
being
extra.
said, I would love to hear in the chat if any of you relate to this. If you've ever felt like you weren't sure you were good enough, you felt a high amount of self-doubt, or that you weren't sure you had earned your accomplishments. Yes. Yeah. Every day. Yeah, honestly, I think talking about it, understanding how common it is, and it does affect some people more than others, but you'd be surprised some of the people you admire the most might have come against this feeling. Yeah, so thank y'all for sharing this. Yeah, and Professor Hurwitz, you feel it too as an instructor. Yeah. All right. So I'm looking at time. We're about halfway through. Don't worry, we're going to get to solutions, right? Because we just talked about how bad is it? What are the things that contribute to how bad it is? We're going to talk first, starting with ourselves, right? Before going out there in the world and trying to combat bias, we have to combat the bias within ourselves. And then we'll talk about bigger solutions, right? But one solution to start with ourselves is that imposter, recognizing that we can give ourselves credit for our work and that we are doing a good job and that we are doing our best, right? And that struggle is fine, failure is fine. And sometimes it's out of our control, like that example where it was the technology in the lab rather than the scientist herself. Okay, so self-awareness is the first step in terms of recognizing what are the identities you hold that might be different than other people's experience. What marginalized identities do you hold? What privileged identities do you hold? How does that unique recipe impact your day-to-day life? There's a common theory called intersectionality by a professor, Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's basically the more marginalized identities you hold, the more you might combat intersecting oppression. Think of it like intersections on a street, right? If you are a Black woman, you might get hit by a car on the racism street and you might get hit by a car on the gender street. And if you also are Muslim at the same time, you might get hit by a car on the Islamic. So it's basically saying you're more at risk for different kinds of oppression. And I don't mean to say that that means you're doomed or anything like that, but it is to recognize that some people have more systemic factors impacting their life and may be more vulnerable to systemic factors than others. So understanding what are the parts of your identity that are privileged or are minoritized, and how does that impact you, right? Just that self-awareness is a really good first step. And then where you run into those differences, where you run into meeting someone who has a different identity than you that you've never interacted with. I love this quote by Io Tillett-Wright, which is, familiarity is the gateway drug to empathy. So a lot of times when we don't know what it's like to, for example, be trans like Io is, understanding more about that identity and making more friends with trans folks can help us really understand it more and be able to advocate for those people better in certain spaces like the STEM space. So surround yourself with content, experiences, and people from different backgrounds from yourself. And one thing you don't want to do is just expect them to tell you about it, right? Because there's already podcasts and articles and things out there of people talking. So don't just, walk up to someone who maybe uses an interpreter and say, tell me everything there is to know about being deaf and using an interpreter, right? Like that's asking them to do a lot of emotional labor. But do surround yourself with content, watch TV shows, right, that are about different experiences. And just embrace the discomfort of knowing that we're constantly going to be unlearning. There's a really great TED Talk that we just don't have time to watch, but I am going to put it in the chat. And I'm also going to put a bystander intervention training in the chat because we'll talk about that next. But it's about moving from the tonsils paradigm of social justice, where we say you either have tonsils or you don't. You're either woke or you're not. You either are racist or you're not. And moving into the dental hygiene. I have to brush and floss my teeth every day. I need to work on my biases every day. I have to learn about the changes in people's identities and worldviews and political spectrum every single day, right? So it's not an all or nothing thing. It's an everyday practice, right? And so this is from an organization I really like, Hollaback. They say we all have bias. Expect it, but don't accept it, right? We need to act on those to make sure we're creating a more inclusive space. So this one I'll kind of breeze through so we can move ahead. But speaking of when bias occurs, why don't we speak up, right? Have you ever been in a classroom where there was maybe a group project and someone got picked last, or where a comment was made that made someone like, oh, women aren't good at math, like something as simple as that? Hopefully you haven't heard something in a classroom, hopefully we're all a little bit better than that. But sometimes that might happen and you might not speak up, right? Why don't we speak up? Usually we start to think, we get on our heads about it. We're like, I'm not sure if that really happened. I don't know if I should say something. I'm worried if I bring it up, it'll just make it worse. It would be better to just move on. Maybe it wasn't a big deal, or maybe I didn't really think it was that. So we do like this meme, right, where we're just like doing all these calculations to talk about why we shouldn't respond. But the research on bystander intervention shows that if you bring it up and you say, hey, that was sexist, or hey, that wasn't very fair, I don't think that's true, it actually reduces biased attitudes among both the person who said the biased comment and the observers in the area. And bystanders who speak up are viewed more positively by others. So I would really recommend learning more about how to challenge yourself to speak up. The research also showed that it's never too late to respond, even if it's a day later or a week later or a month later, and you say, hey, I heard that comment about X, Y, or Z, or you not being good in a lab, or whatever it might be, you not having good technical skills or something like that, right? You can bring that back up and just tell the person it wasn't okay, you're sorry you didn't speak up, or you're sorry they had to experience that. And that can really help, even just when something biased happens and someone is being discriminated against. A knowing look, just looking at them with sympathy and saying like that wasn't cool with just your facial expression, can make a difference in how that person is negatively impacted by the bias, right? They're less likely to have those negative impacts because someone understands and empathized with them, okay? So again, going through really quickly, but there's a training on this. Hollaback is an organization, they do a lot of free online trainings, but the different ways that you can speak up when bias occurs. So you can distract, you don't have to just, a lot of people go straight to direct, right? That was racist, that was sexist. That's not cool, right? Speaking up directly, but there's other things you can do to diffuse the situation, right? You can distract, you can, if, for example, this is more like if someone's being like verbally attacked or something, you just need to distract the perpetrator to get them away. But you can also get help from someone else. So if you see something happen in a classroom, delegate to your professor, ask for some help, right? Document, this one's again for more like something like if you see street harassment, which is what Hollaback really focuses on, but they do all kinds of bias. But sometimes it can be good to write down what you saw, especially in a workplace, right, where someone's discriminated against. That documentation can really help if they do decide to take action or go to HR. And then delay, right? This is the one I was talking about where after something happens, you can just check in with the person and be like, hey, I heard that or I saw that and that wasn't okay. And I just want you to know that you're not alone. That can work wonders. And then what if the bias is directed at you, right? A lot of us here might have experienced bias directly. And so we're not talking about bystander intervention because we're not the bystander, we're the target. Really, just do what you need to do to take care of yourself. There's no right or wrong answer, unfortunately, because we don't know how we're going to react when we're targeted by bias or inappropriate comments. So don't feel the need to respond, but really do know that if you want to, there are options. So I'm going to put a great article in the chat for that. Again, I know this presentation is full of a bunch of resources, so copy what you want, leave what you don't want. And so the options that you have are deciding not to respond, responding immediately, or responding later. And each of those has kind of pros and cons associated with them. And there's even a handout from the Illinois Women in Engineering program about responding to bias and what you can do when that happens. So I'm putting that in the chat right now as well. Microaggressions and bias and how to respond specifically for women in engineering. So I won't cover this too much because I know we're wanting to we're wanting to move forward into solutions. So let's talk about this a little bit. Programs and strategies for improving inclusion. So this is from the GCC alum who came to our presentation last semester. The solutions that Anush talked about were exposure and representation in media and products, mentorship, education, right? Teaching others about biases that are out there and also helping bring education, STEM education to women and minoritized groups earlier. Laws and regulations that protect us, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, Title IX. So before I go on too much, Professor Herworth, is this a good time to bring up the group project that you've been working on?
Sorry, sure. I was muted there. So I think I did, let me send something in chat. I reference here a document from the National Science Foundation. Every 2 years, they do a report on women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in engineering and STEM. So that's a really good resource. I might be able to, oh, thank you. I think it's pulled up. Yeah, so this page that it came up to is about women degrees awarded to women in engineering. So there's lots of good information at a place like that that you could check out. And so basically the federal government is doing a lot of studying on this issue. But for me in engineering, I know that there are a lot of disciplines that cover issues of bias very well. So social science classes, even your English classes, ethnic studies courses. So, but for us in engineering, we have to cover a great deal of technical information. But that doesn't mean that we can't engage this material as well. And but for me, as being an engineer being a very applied science, applied math discipline, I think about how can we apply this information to the work that we normally do, and that way incorporate it into how we work. And one of those things is that you'll notice that many times in an engineering course or a STEM course, a science course that has a lab, you're working in teams. Maybe your lab group is 4 people in a lab group. And what happens in that lab group many times is kind of, biased interactions between people. Maybe there's assumptions made and so forth. So one of the things that I wanted to do was work on sort of a little bit of instruction or a checklist of things students can think about as they form their group. And if they think about acting in certain ways as they go about working on their design project or the lab, then maybe that could be a way that we could help for all people who are in the group, or maybe some of them are minorities, that they can also engage in that anti-bias activity. So I don't know, I could share a spreadsheet just to give an example. And if it's okay, I'm going to bump it. And let's see. Sorry, so this is not very efficient. I'm not seeing my spreadsheet. There we go. Okay, sorry, I have too many files open.
No worries at all.
Let me try it again. Okay, so this is just a very first draft, initial thing in progress. Almost hesitate to share it, but let's say you're forming a group to do a design project. You may not even be able to see it. The font is kind of small. But what if there was a list of things that you could go through to make sure that everyone was involved, right? So in the beginning, it's like introductions over here. And then what's the consideration? Does everyone in the group know each other, right? And what's a suggested action so that people can get to know each other, play a name game or go around and introduce each other. So the idea is that if you know each other, then that'll help for your team building. If you get to know each other, you're less likely to exclude that person in your project, right? So that one's pretty simple, but then there are some other things. Communications, right? Is the contact communication functional? Do you have periodic communication amongst the group, right? Someone left off the communication email list, right? Did you confirm that everyone's on that email list, okay? Then later on, sort of respectful interactions, right? Are all team members thinking about implicit biases? Question duty assignments. When you form a group, who gets to do what? How do you decide who gets to do what in the group? Is there some clear mechanism for deciding who works on one type of calculation and who works on another? Is there a need for a note taker in the group? Are you calling that person a secretary? Many times women get delegated that role and without much thought, or sometimes a female group member may volunteer for it. And then the question is why? Is that something that they really want to do? But ironically, a secretary or a note taker in a group it's actually a very powerful position because you have this opportunity to affect the minutes and what actually gets recorded in activities. So the question is, how do you decide on who gets to do what and why? What's your requirements for someone to get to do some job? Should you rotate these jobs? Should people take turns? Should you take turn being a group leader, right? And so if you have some formal checklist, can a group kind of go through these things and address some of the pitfalls, especially when someone feels like they're left out, right? I'm going to stop the share now. If someone feels like they're left out of the process, they're less likely to perform. If someone makes a suggestion, but then they're not listened to, and then 10 minutes later, someone else says something very similar, and that is accepted, how does that person feel, right? So is there someone checking for that? For example, if everyone's going around and brainstorming, is someone timing the amount of time that each person gets to contribute? Is one person talking longer than another person, and why? And can you think about those processes as you're in your group? Make sure each person gets an equal ability to contribute to the project, right? Because these are your future networking the coworkers. You never know who's going to be interviewing you when you go for a job. And if you have this experience of supporting each other, then help you from the networking point of view. And then lastly, I would say, make sure that you vouch for other people. Give credit to everyone in your group. Is there a process where everyone goes around and makes sure that everyone else is recognized for the work that they've done, especially when you're reporting out to an instructor or manager or giving a presentation? So these kinds of thought processes inside of a design project group or a lab group can maybe make a really good project, maybe increase your grade, increase the make a strong benefit to the outcome of that project. So that's kind of a thing that I'm trying to work into classes that I'm teaching. We do have an introduction to engineering design at our campus. We've got material science laboratory, where something like this would be applicable if there's a group project in a computer-aided design course. It would also be kind of applicable to that. And as you go through your engineering pathway, you will definitely have more and more classes where you'll be working in groups. It will be a requirement for almost every upper division course that you have to do some kind of a project. So anyway, I think I'll stop there. Thank you for the time.
No, thank you for that. That's, I think so much of this is just information based, and that's really practical, right? That's like, as a student, what can you do? And I really commend you for bringing them to the classroom from the professor perspective, because you already are so worried about getting everybody to learn these technical skills. It does take extra effort to invest in learning these socio-emotional inclusion, anti-bias skills. So I think that's huge, that we're working on that and integrating that more and more. So we're gonna stop the recording soon and have more of a discussion, but just to finish off the last couple of things in terms of programs and strategies that are making things better. Professional associations. There's Women in Engineering, Society of Women Engineers, and not just that, right? It's based on ethnicity. Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, SHIP, is a great organization that we've had a presence on our campus. We've been able to go to conferences in the past, and all sorts of things. So whatever identity you have, look up if there's maybe a professional association associated with that. And if you ever wanted to meet with a counselor, and one of our career education counselors can help you like look for support programs that you might qualify for based on your different identities. Employee resource groups are also huge. One of the people who spoke recently at our Latinx Heritage panel is a engineer at Northrop Grumman, and their organization had an employee resource group for Latinx professionals, and they hosted a panel for their employees at the organization to talk more about helping Latinx folks improve and advance within the company, right? And also just share their experiences, and others could come and listen. Training and awareness are making a huge difference. So they have shown that like learning more about bias, all of you attending and watching this today are making a difference just by increasing your awareness about what the biases are and how to combat them. And then again, like Professor Herbert said, there's a lot of research being done about this. There's reports. There was a US national report during, I think, the Obama administration that's like pages long, like 20 plus pages long, about what we can do about this and what's already been successful. So we are changing it. I want to make sure y'all feel encouraged. But of course, we know that every one of us has to play a part in, no matter how big or no matter how small, in creating a more inclusive STEM environment. So yeah, we need to collectively change the culture. Within organizations, we can do a bunch of strategy about how to be more inclusive, but culture eats strategy for breakfast is what a business management expert says. So we really have to change the culture around how we think about who should be in this room, who belongs in STEM, who do we need in STEM? And the truth is we need more folks. We need more diverse experiences and backgrounds and people coming from different life, all sorts of life identities. So I'm going to end with these questions and then we'll have a discussion. But what are your takeaways from today? What actions are you personally committed to address bias within yourself and the field of STEM? What can you do today yourself to make a difference, right? For some of us, that just might mean succeeding as ourselves. For others, it might be helping get more people in the room or pave the way for others. What strategies, support, and resources do you have to help you combat any potential bias you might face in the field of STEM? So with that being said, let me go ahead and stop this recording. For those of you viewing later, thanks for watching this.